In this lecture, we will discuss the action potential and automaticity of the sinus node and contractile myocytes. Action potential is characterized by depolarization or activation followed by repolarization or recovery. It occurs in all cardiomyocytes, although its appearance varies based on the cell type. Sodium, potassium, and calcium ions continue to flow back and forth across the cell membrane during depolarization and repolarization, and it is because these ions are electrically charged that an electrical current is generated. Now, fluids and tissues that surround the heart consist of ions and therefore can act as electrical conductors. As a result, electrical currents generated in the myocardium can then be transmitted to the skin and detected by electrodes. It is then these electrical currents that are captured and recorded on the EKG paper. It's important to note that the electrical potentials of the conduction system are too small to be detected by surface electrodes, and therefore the EKG records the electrical activity of the atria and ventricles. So let's take a moment to look at the automaticity of pacemaker cells. We're going to start with the sinus node. So the sinus node's automaticity of pacemaker cells begins with noting that these cells leak sodium ions into the cell as soon as they return to the resting state, which is referred to as the pacemaker potential. Okay, so if you look here, we're looking at our sinus atria, our sinus node, the action potential of it, and here in phase 4, okay, in green, this is our cell down here, okay, this is the extracellular area, okay, and then we have the intracellular, here's our cytoplasm, and in this case, this pacemaker potential, phase 4 here, we have sodium ions that are leaking into the cell, okay, and that's what we call our pacemaker potential, where we have these sodium influx at the resting state of the sinus node, okay. Now, as the sodium ions continue to leak into the cell membrane becomes more positive, and when the membrane reaches a threshold potential of about -40 millivolts, the action potential is triggered and the cell depolarizes, okay. So notice here, right now we're at around -70, okay, and then as more ions and more positively charged sodium ions enter the cell, okay, now we're going to be going up in our electrical potential, okay, and once it reaches around this -40 marker, okay, we then reach this threshold potential, and that's when depolarization again starts. At the same point at which the cell begins depolarizing, the voltage-gated calcium channels open, allowing calcium ions to flow into the cell and contribute to depolarization, okay. So again, you have these calcium ions, which are these ones here, okay, contributing to depolarization. So this is that phase 0 of the sinus node action potential, which is our depolarization phase. And notice we have our sodium ions that are giving us that trigger of reaching our threshold, and then we have also these calcium gated channels that then open and allow for depolarization to continue. Notice we have more positive ions entering the cell, and that's why you see us moving up in millivolts to a more positive direction. Now, the action potential is able to propagate to other cardiomyocytes because they are all electrically connected by gap junctions, which allow for ions to flow between cells. Okay, now after depolarization, the potassium ion channels open, okay, and this allows potassium ions to flow out of the cell, which leads to repolarization. So now we have positive ions, positive potassium ions, moving out of the cell, okay, and because they're moving out of the cell, the inside of the cell is going to become more negative, okay, and that's why we see this in repolarization. We start to go down in the potential and become more negative because we have more positive ions, the potassium ions, moving out of the cell. And next we have the sodium ions that will begin to leak back into the cell, and the cycle will continue, okay. So again, here we're back to phase 4, and we see these sodium ions leaking back into the cell, and this whole cycle will continue, okay, and it will go back to this point, and once we reach the threshold, we'll have depolarization, calcium ions will enter, okay, and then eventually the repolarization. You'll have this that just continues, and again, this is with our sinus node, the sinoatrial node's pacemaker, okay. So that's those pacemaker cells, but other contractile cells are different. Contractile cells within the myocardium, so both the atria and the ventricles, actually have a true resting potential, and this is known as phase 4, and this is around -90 millivolts, and as a result of this resting potential, these cells need to be stimulated in order to elicit an action potential. Once stimulated, sodium ion channels open, leading to rapid influx of sodium, and the cell begins to depolarize. Contraction and relaxation of these contractile cells is delayed a few milliseconds after depolarization and repolarization respectively. Now the total duration of the action potential is about 0.2 seconds or 200 milliseconds in the atrial myocardium, while it's 0.3 seconds or 300 milliseconds in the ventricular myocardium. So let's go through the phases of the action potential in our contractile myocyte. Let's start with phase 4, which was the resting phase here, and here only the potassium channels are open and potassium ions are flowing out of the cell, and this establishes that negative resting potential of about negative 90 millivolts. Okay, so our contractile myocyte, again, here's our cell down here. And what we're seeing at that resting phase, which is this here, phase 4, we have potassium ions that are flowing out, okay? And this is our resting potential, okay? So positive ions moving out, and that's why we're around negative 90 millivolts, okay? So potassium efflux here, going out of the cell. Next, we have phase 0, which is the depolarization phase, just like we saw with the sinus node. So phase 0 is our depolarization phase here, and upon stimulation, sodium ions will flow into the cell, okay, thereby causing depolarization and an increase in the potential to about positive 20 millivolts. Okay, so now we have some stimulation, and after that we get depolarization, so we have sodium ions that are flowing into the cell, so positive ions going in, and because of that we have this depolarization that will go up to about positive 20 millivolts in this point here. Okay, so that's phase 0, which is depolarization. Now during phase 1, which is considered the early repolarization phase, the potassium channels open and there's a brief efflux or potassium ions moving out of the cell, which slightly repolarizes the cell. So this is that rapid repolarization or early repolarization phase, phase 1 here in yellow. Okay, again we have some potassium ions moving out, and that's why we see a slight drop in the potential there. Okay, so phase 1 is that early repolarization phase. Then we have phase 2, or the plateau phase, in which calcium channels open, allowing calcium ions to enter the cell, and this influx of calcium ions gives rise to the plateau phase. Its long duration explains why most of the ventricular myocardium contracts nearly simultaneously throughout. So now we have calcium ions flowing into the cell, and because of that we have this plateau phase. Okay, so we're staying up there, so even though this potassium moves out, we drop a little, but now we have positive ions staying in. Okay, and that's where we get that plateau phase, and we'll see in future lectures that that actually represents the ST segment, okay, on EKG. Then, so we have this plateau phase, and now we have the third phase, or phase 3, which is the repolarization phase, in which the calcium channels close and the potassium channels open. Okay, so calcium channels closing, and we have potassium channels opening, and this allows for an efflux, or potassium ions moving out of the cell, and repolarization of that cell. So now we have potassium ions moving out. This is phase 3, the repolarization phase that we have going on. Okay, and so this cycle will continue to repeat itself once the cell is stimulated again. Okay, we come back to our phase 4, where again we're pretty much at this point here, and then once it's stimulated, we'll go have sodium ions come in, be depolarized again, and this will continue. Now note that during the absolute refractory period, a new stimulus cannot trigger a new action potential, regardless of its strength. However, during the relative refractory period, a strong stimulation may actually trigger a new action potential. So these phases are here. Let me just erase this. So this is the absolute refractory period, in which there's no stimulus that can trigger an action potential, a new one. And then we have this relative refractory period, that if you have a strong stimulus, you can actually get a new action potential that starts over, okay, and that will stimulate the whole thing, and this whole process will begin again. So let's briefly review what we discussed before we end here. So we'll go through our notes. So again, an action potential represents depolarization or activation of the cell, as well as repolarization or recovery. Okay, we saw that in both cases, depolarization and activation. This occurs in all cardiomyocytes, but it varies among the cell type. We looked at the sinus node, and then all the other types, the atrial and the ventricular, would be represented here. Now, We have flow of electrically charged ions that leads to an electrical current, and because of this, we also have those conductors that surrounding fluids and tissues around the heart that act as conductors that then allow the current to go to the electrodes, and that's where we get our EKG from. Now, there's one thing to note is that the electrical potentials that we're reading are not coming from the conducting system of the heart because they're too small. Instead, we're recording the atrial and ventricular activity on the EKG. Now, in terms of the sinoatrial node action potential, we said that this pacemaker potential, which is phase 4, okay, this phase here, so we'll just erase this and go through it again. So phase 4 here, this action pacemaker potential, is when we have sodium influx into the cell, okay? So that's the beginning of it. That's phase 4. Then we have, as the sodium comes in, we get to an action potential near negative 40 millivolts, okay? So around this point here. And then calcium influx is also occurring. Calcium's coming into the cell, and because of this, we get that depolarization phase once we reach that threshold, okay? And then eventually, now potassium starts leaving the cell, and then we come to our repolarization phase, phase 3, okay? And then this whole thing will start over again. Remember, these action potentials are propagated because of these gap junctions that allow ions to flow in between cells, okay? And one thing to note before we move on to the next one, phase 4 are both the same. So notice this is somewhat of a resting potential. This is a true resting potential in the contractile myocytes. And phase 0 here is also the depolarization phase 0 with the contractile myocyte, and the same thing is for the repolarization. Okay, so those numbers are the same. The only thing here with the contractile cells, we have phase 1, we have phase 2 as well, that are not in the sinoatrial nodes action potential. Okay, now to the contractile myocytes, we said this has a true resting potential, and therefore it needs to be stimulated. We need some stimulus. We don't have this constant flow or activity as we see in the sinus node. So we start with this potassium efflux, or potassium going out of the cell, and this gives us a resting state of around negative 90 millivolts. The cell is stimulated. We get a rapid influx of sodium ions. This leads to depolarization, phase 0. Then we get potassium efflux, where we have that early repolarization, phase 1. We get a calcium influx, which leads to our plateau, phase 2. And then we have the calcium channels closing, and then potassium leaving the cell, and we have repolarization. And eventually this cycle continues. Now the total action potential in the atria is about 200 milliseconds, and in the ventricles about 300 milliseconds. Remember, with the absolute refractory period, we cannot have a stimulus that triggers a new action potential. But during that relative refractory period, okay, we can actually have a strong stimulus that can trigger a new action potential. Well, that's the end of this lecture. We discussed the action potential and automaticity of the sinus node and contractile myocytes. I hope you learned something.